Hello world, and this is Angular Air. Thank you very much for listening or watching. We are the Angular Broadcast Podcast, and today we're going to be talking about React and Angular 2. So yeah, it's going to be an interesting subject. Before we get started into our subject though, let me just go ahead and introduce our guests. And when I say your name, please wave and say hi so people know who is who. So our first guest is Tero Parvebian. And of course, I butchered his last name again. I didn't even say it the way I practiced it. And then our second guest is Minko Getchev. And they both have some experience with React and Angular 2, and so their perspective is invaluable for this episode. We're excited to chat with them. We have our panelists also, Amy Knight.
Hello.
And Jeff Welpley.
Hello.
And Patrick J.S.
Hey guys.
And my name is Kenzie Dodds. I'm your host. And before we get started, I'm going to go through a couple of quick announcements. Remember, if you're watching live, you can ask questions on Twitter using the hashtag NGAirQuestion, and we will answer those at the end of the show. So if you have any questions while our show progresses, then ask there. And then some general announcements. We will have a show next week, but it's not scheduled, so just tune in same time, same place next week, and it will be amazing, I assure you. And then follow us on Twitter and Google+, as always, at Angular Air. I feel like I'm a stewardess on an airplane at this point with these announcements. They're always the same. Yeah, okay, so let's get into our main content. I think it'd be good just to get an introduction to each of our guests and your experience with Angular 1, Angular 2, and React. So we'll start out with Tero, if you can give us an intro, and then we'll go to Minko.
Sure. So yeah, hi, I'm Tero, software engineer, independent contractor, and occasional book and article writer from Helsinki. I've been working with Angular for about maybe 3 years now, and 2 of those with the same app actually, which I'm still working on. And then I've been playing with React, both React itself and its various ClojureScript and other bindings for the past year or so.
You say the words ClojureScript, and I'm like, oh man, this guy's a boss. Awesome.
Yeah, ClojureScript is great. Yeah.
Yeah, the only next level of boss is Elm. If you'd said you did both ClojureScript and Elm, then I'd just be like, oh, yeah, hands down.
I've actually compiled one Elm program, so
cool.
I do have that as well in my CV.
Sweet. Cool. Minko.
Hi. So I'm an independent contractor as well, and actually for the last 2 or 3 years I work with the same company, so maybe it's not the correct term. I've used Angular 1 in the past. Last year and a half I'm using React with ECMAScript 2015 and TypeScript, and last month or 2 I'm trying to find time to contribute to Angular 2.
Cool. We thank you for your contributions. Okay, so before we actually get started into this show, I want to put out a quick disclaimer. There are a lot of like Angular versus React. Angular is so much better, React is so much better, whatever. That's not what this show is about. What this show is about is we have 2 developers on who, and a couple of us actually have experience with both Angular and React, and Angular 2 in particular. But these developers still want to use Angular 2 when it comes out. And so this is more about like your experience with using Angular 2 and using React, how they compare from like your use cases. And this is in no way, shape, or form like a complete overview of what React is, what Angular is, and like why is one definitively better than the other. If you want a spoiler alert, I think the answer, most of us will agree that they're both awesome and they both solve a huge amount of use cases. And if you choose one or the other, you will be just fine. So yeah, I just want to put that disclaimer out there. This is not a bashing show. Okay, so Yeah, actually, Olivier, he couldn't make it, but he has a good question to start us out with. And I think, yeah, let's just go with this. So what, between Angular 2 and React and Angular 1, what do you use at the moment for your projects? Like if you were going to start a new project today, what would you want to use? And then what do you use for the projects you're working on now?
Mm-hmm. Well, me, the application I'm working on day in, day out is an Angular 1 application. And what we are focusing on with that at the moment is basically aligning it to the architectural style of our Angular 2, and that's pretty much where we are with that. And then I use various things for my side projects and experiments. Basically any bandwagon that comes my way, I'll jump it, including things like React and Redux and things like that lately.
Cool, and you, Minko?
Yeah, right now I'm using React. Last year or two, I'm using React. In my spare time, I'm doing some pet projects in Angular 2.
Cool. Do you? Let's just make sure that our assumptions are correct here. Do you both plan to use Angular 2 when it comes out? Is that kind of your expectation right now?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, me too. I've actually tried to adopt the dependency injection of Angular 2 in my React projects.
How's that gone?
Well, initially I started with DI.js. After that, they deprecated it and they integrated the dependency injection into the core. So it got kind of tricky.
Yeah, if anybody's interested in that concept, I know that Merrick Christensen, who is just an awesome developer, he works at Domo, and he's one of the organizers of ngConf. But he gave a talk recently at I think it was Mountain West JS or yeah, some conference that we have here in Utah, about his Frankenstein app, which is like pieces of all these different frameworks that he likes, and he kind of pieces them all together. So he used DI.js and had some React in there, and yeah, a lot of really interesting things. I never watched it personally, but I know Merrick, and he's awesome. So if you're interested in that, maybe you could check that out. So as a good kickoff, let's talk about Angular 2 and how it compares with Angular or with React. How are they similar and how are they different?
Well, to my mind, they seem to be more similar than they are different, at least. Like that's what it looks like to me. I haven't used Angular 2 much yet. I just been reading up on it and trying to track where it's going and what the main ideas are. But I think in both of these frameworks, and I think it originates in React really, is the core concept of components and the component tree, and the data flow in that tree, which is data down and actions up, and that's kind of the central idea, I think, of both of these things. And of course, Angular is more like a kitchen sink framework in the sense that it has a lot more than React does, where with React you use various other libraries to augment it when you actually want to do something bigger than a plain little UI, and Angular basically has much more built into it, and that's how I would see the main difference between those two.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. The main difference I see is the way they detect basically state changes, the diffing algorithms.
Mm.
Well, yeah, it's definitely the diffing algorithm. So I'm curious, as far as that goes, the React uses virtual DOM diffing, so it will detect changes and then see what needs to be pushed to be displayed. Well, Angular at a low level stores a lot more, caches a lot more in memory, like for optimization reasons. And so there's advantages and disadvantages to each of those approaches. So I'm curious what you guys think, just from that one aspect, because that is one difference between Angular 2 and React, and there are kind of, depending on how you look at it, some advantages and disadvantages. So what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, I'd also like to know more about this, which is that because I heard something about Angular 2 having something like a virtual DOM-like system in it. I think that's something Igor tweeted like a year ago or something, but I don't know whether that's actually how it turned out. So maybe someone on the call knows.
Well, it doesn't do diffing, right? It does change detection to see what has been updated, and then so I mean that's just like it doesn't necessarily have to be that big of a substantial difference from a high level, but then again, Angular 2 hasn't been out, really in the wild, so you don't know kind of how that will impact. Their approach will ultimately impact things as opposed to the React approach.
Yeah, the way I see them, yeah, sure. The way I see them is maybe on the first side, the React's change detection diffing algorithm looks kind of a little bit more flexible, because what you do is that you have this method should component update, and you can compare some data, and based on whether the current state of the component should be updated, you can find that at exactly this should component update method by comparing some values. And on the other side, if you have this, if the component should update and the should component update method returns true, you have one more level, which is the React's virtual DOM patching algorithm, which finds the difference between the component trees, and it can, with that, I think the algorithm's complexity there was like linear. They have some heuristics, so they have optimized it. And yeah, you have these two levels compared to Angular 2, where you compare only the data which is held by the component using specific differ. And based on this, you find out whether you need to update your component or not, whether it needs to be re-rendered.
Yeah, so basically React, you have this component, and it creates a tree of other like elements as well. So React's diffing. So when you say like virtual DOM, it's a little bit weird because virtual DOM associates with React, which associates with everything React does, and because of that, like you shouldn't say virtual DOM when you're talking about like Angular 2, but technically you could. With React, you're diffing elements as well, not as opposed to Angular 2, where you're only diffing the bindings. Mm-hmm. So that's like one difference between the two in terms of diffing algorithms.
I guess the interesting thing with that is that that's like a low-level implementation detail, right? Like developers don't necessarily care about that per se. I think the thing where they're similar, like you guys started to say, is that there are a lot of similarities, right, between Angular and React, and that might be some implementation detail of how they figure out what's been modified. But sort of some of the concepts around data flow, I think, are similar. So like Minko, maybe can you give us like a little bit of some background, because I know you've done a lot with this for data flow and that type of thing, of like some of the similarities of like some key concepts that like both frameworks have kind of keyed in on.
Yeah, about the similarities, both library and framework. I think the React community prefers to call React library. So both of them, they are actually, I would say that they are enforcing this unidirectional data flow. Usually, the components, they receive their data from the parent components, or eventually, if you're not fan of this unidirectional data flow, everything coming from the top, you can listen for changes and build something like MVC, but I'm talking about the case when you use Flux-like architecture. So in this case, in both frameworks, you receive your components receive data as properties, and the data goes from the top of the component tree through the bottom.
But then with that approach, you wind up drilling holes all the way down to the leaves of your components, right? And so there is kind of this concept of a data store where your components can reach up and get the data they want from that store. Is that? I guess that's a different kind of approach, and that makes those components less pure themselves, but maybe makes it a little easier to develop, so you don't have to drill holes all the way down to the leaves of your components. Is that accurate?
Yeah, well, at least in Redux, they have these names of smart and dumb components that they use, which are smart components are things that are connected to stores and know how to pull things out of them and send actions back to them. And then there are these dumb components or pure components that do neither. They basically get all their data in as props and send their actions out as callbacks, which are also props. So they have these distinctions, and I think the general idea is to try to minimize the amount of smart components because of the way it makes things a little bit more difficult to figure out and test. But you usually need more than one per app of those, especially if it's a large app, since otherwise you end up having to wire them all, wire the data through all of the components.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so the thing about like smart and dumb components is that like a smart component manages the model and sends it down to its children. So you could also think of that as the controller in Angular 1, and you could think of all the dumb components as just regular directives like the form directive and everything. The difference is how we isolate the logic and move around everything, but you could think of it as just kind of reworking and reimagining like where the logic should live.
Yeah, that's exactly what I've been starting to do in my Angular 1 in the big app right now, which is to actually have this distinction between these two types of components. And the way it has turned out for me is that smart components are things that pull things out from injected services, essentially. And when things happen, they make method calls to those services to do the server updates or whatever. And then you have quite few of those, and they are then composed of a collection of dumb components, which basically get all their data in from the parent as directive attributes or bindings. And also, when something happens inside those components, that action is basically propagated up through a expression binding, so that they don't actually side effect themselves, but just pass the action up to the parent.
So in that scenario then, just because I think this seems like a reasonable thing to do in Angular 1, as you said, like let's say that you have a list, so the dumb component would never actually send an update to the server. Like if you're editing a post or something, it would just say, you hit the save button, and you, instead of updating the server directly, you'd say on save clicked, and you'd invoke that with the post contents. Okay. Yeah, that's reasonable, and that same sort of story applies to both React and Angular 2 in a component-based architecture. Yeah, okay, I gotta refactor some stuff.
Me too. A lot of stuff.
Makes a lot more sense. So what I'm getting, based off of what has been said so far, is that there are a few implementation differences between Angular 2 and React, and some of them may have performance implications, but those implementation details don't really have a huge or make a huge difference on the developer experience. Maybe I'm missing something there, but it sounds to me like the main difference that would change your opinion of what you would want to use is the fact that Angular 2 is more of a kitchen sink, everything that you need for an app, whereas React is a piece of what you need for an app, and you have to find all the other pieces to build an app. Is that accurate, or is there something else that I'm missing?
Well, I would also add the kind of emphasis on the language used. I think Angular 2 it looks to me like it's going to be like heavily investing in TypeScript, not just the core team, but the community as well. I don't know whether that will be actually what happens, but it seems to me that that's the case. Whereas in React, I don't see that as much.
Can you speak for Flow? Because in the React community, there's this notion of a Flow language, which is kind of like a type system, but there's like some differences between that and TypeScript.
Well, all I can say is everyone seems to be really excited about it. I haven't tried it myself.
Okay.
You tried ClojureScript, but you haven't even tried Flow. No, just kidding. I can't. I am the worst person to judge anybody else on what they do with their free time to learn stuff.
Well, I guess I could talk a little bit about that. But like, one of the differences between Flow and TypeScript is that in TypeScript, you have a separate file to define your types. So you could technically define types for a library that is not written in TypeScript, and that's like one of the huge benefits of TypeScript versus Flow. Where Flow, you actually need to write it in Flow. But yeah.
Okay, so Amy, I think you've got a pretty good question right here. Why don't you fire off with that one? I think these other two that we've got are not. Yeah.
We kind of already talked about this as we were talking about like following component architecture, but I don't know. I'd kind of like to talk about that a little bit more because a lot of us have, you know, like these big controllers. So do you think following that pattern will push us more towards like the React goodness? And this is talking about like Angular 1. So do you think this is, you know, I know Taro, you've actually written some posts about this. So is this like something you've experimented with or something that you've actually used in like a production large application and you think like we should move towards this?
Yeah, I think very much that this is something we should move towards. That's what we are doing at the moment. And yeah, it comes from, it's really informed by React, but the reason we are really doing it is, there are basically two reasons. One is to get us ready for Angular 2, and one is to actually just make sense of the application that we have at the moment in Angular 1. Because most of the code was laid out basically a couple of years ago when components weren't really a thing in the community yet. So we were doing these big controllers, lots of ng controller, lots of ng include, and it's basically a kind of a mess. And then what we're doing at the moment is refactoring that code little by little into directives. And the first step in that is actually that you actually uncover the data flow in your application, the existing data flow, which is kind of hidden or implicit in these kind of old school applications where things just access data from inherited scopes and you really can't see from anywhere where those accesses happen, who's doing them, who's mutating data, and who's accessing data. And the first step towards components is to actually make that visible. And once you've done that, then you can start improving the data flow towards something that will work more closely with how things will go in Angular 2 or even React.
So if people want to like refactor in this way, do you think they're better off like starting from this huge controller and breaking that down like in medium steps, or pick like a tiny portion and pull that out and just pick like these tiny pieces?
The way we're doing it is in little tiny steps, and yeah, I'm basically talking about this next week in Berlin at an Angular meetup, and I'll probably write about it later, which is basically I'm trying to build a library of small refactorings for going from this big controller soup into a component application in tiny steps, because it can be done. And there are intermediate steps you can do. You don't have to kind of do it all at the same time. And it's been kind of interesting to see your application in a new light once you do that, actually, when you actually see the mess you've made.
It's definitely something like kind of for the app I'm on, you know, we don't always have, you know, at a large company, you don't always have the luxury of like playing around with Angular 2 right away. That's something you got to do on your own. So like for people who have large applications and they have to like ship products and don't get to play around too much, it seems like something good you could do with your Angular 1 stuff already.
Yeah, exactly. So we basically spend one day every 2 weeks currently doing this work, and the rest of the time we're just building new features and doing the normal day-to-day work. So we're taking it slow, but it's proceeding quite nicely.
So it sounds like refactoring an Angular 1 app to this type of architecture would help you whether you wanted to migrate to Angular 2 or React. Does that sound about right?
Probably, yeah. We don't have any plans to go to React with this application, but you end up with something that's much closer to how a React app looks like when you have these specific components and end up essentially with a tree of components as you do in React.
Cool. So I think this is a valuable point for our listeners. Anybody who's not certain about Angular 2, like, oh, I don't know if this is going to be what I want it to be or whatever, it's going to be amazing for sure. But if you're still not certain and you're worried about that, I think refactoring to more of a component-based architecture will just be a good idea for you to do in general. And by the time you're done with that, maybe Angular 2 will be out, maybe it won't. Either way, you'll be in a situation where it's a lot easier for you to migrate if that's what you want to do. And even if you don't, I think it would make your application a lot easier, even leaving it in Angular 1, is what it kind of sounds like to me.
They tease me at work that I'm on a component crusade.
I think that's an okay thing to to be on.
Yes.
Cool. So I actually wanted to ask one other thing, Tero, about your migration. So, or what you're doing. So, if I understand it correctly, the best approach is to start small, like at the leaf component that you want to build, and make as many dumb components as you can. Work your way up until you get to like the smart component level, and then you move on to the next area. Is that kind of what you're doing?
Well, kind of the part, especially where you start from the leaves, because that's where you kind of have to start with this. But what we are doing is we're not actually thinking about smart versus dumb at this point when we're just componentizing. We're essentially just making all the existing data bindings, whether they are two-way bindings or method calls or whatever, we're making them explicit in each component's scope definition or controller bind to controller attribute. So the first step is to end up with these components, but the data flow is exactly pretty much what it was before you went to components. And I think that's a crucial intermediate step, because at that point you see what your actual data flow is in your application. Because it's too easy to break it when you kind of do several things at the same time. So we preserve the functionality by going and by at the same time going into components, and then we start to look at the data flow.
That's awesome. I think that's a fantastic pro tip. I gave a training on ES6, migrating to ES6, a month or two ago at a conference, and what we did in our migration was like you start with the smallest possible thing that you could do. Like, don't change anything else. Just even if your change is 5 lines of code, leave that, make that, like, get that into the code base. Because if you work on for 2 weeks on this big migration and then product comes to you and says, hey, we need to drop everything because we're going onto this, like, need to build this feature or whatever, then what you wind up with is a pull request that'll never get merged because it's old and it's huge. So yeah, that's cool. Good pro tip.
So I had another question. Some people have talked about using Flux in Angular 1. What are your thoughts on that?
I have never tried that.
Anybody else?
Yeah, I haven't really tried that neither. I know that on Angular Connect there's going to be a talk on similar topic. I think it's how to design large AngularJS applications that scale. And I built some directive for easier binding to immutable data structures to Angular 1 in Angular 1, and there were some guys who helped me, so they did some pull requests, and they were working on similar stuff, but they were using these immutable data structures with Flux. So it's kind of popular, but I've never tried it either.
Well, Miko, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems from like our previous conversation and from what I've seen is like anything is possible. I mean, it's all JavaScript, right? So you can do whatever you want. But given the way that Angular 1 is set up, it's much harder to implement some of those patterns just because so much of it is by default dependent on kind of the change detection and having mutable data and everything like that. So you can kind of jam in there some of these more immutable patterns. and stuff coming from the React world. And people have done it. I've seen it out there. But I don't know about you. I've never seen one that like made me think like, oh, that seems like a good idea. Whereas in Angular 2, you do see the starting of some of those implementations where they actually are, pretty good match for the way it's supposed to be.
Yeah, I agree. You need to follow very strict conventions for how to add event listener, how to add watchers, how to pass data to your directives. It's not trivial.
So would you say that you wouldn't recommend to Angular 1 apps for them to try and implement Flux? Like it's just a little too much more work than it's worth?
Yeah, I see it like that. Yeah.
There's a Flux implementation in Angular 1 called Flux-Angular that has all the boilerplate to set up Flux Angular.
Yeah, I mean that's what I'm talking about. That like, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. I've seen those types of implementations. I guess I've never been tempted to use that. Like there's a lot of the type of overhead that you have to add in order to get. You don't necessarily get the same benefit, right? It's kind of like I always feel like trying to jam a square peg into a round hole.
Well, it's an architectural thing, right? So it depends on like what makes sense for the project. So have you guys played around with Redux at all, or heard of Redux, or decided to implement those patterns in Angular 1 or 2?
I want to add only one more thing about Flux. Victor Savkin had a blog post about Flux with Flux with Angular 1. Victor Savkin from the core team, so it might be interesting. I'll post the link.
Yeah, on Redux, I think many of the same points apply. It's because it's basically an evolution of Flux. Really, it's a lot simpler than Flux, I think. But you can definitely use it with both Angular 1 and 2, and I think someone has actually made even in bindings for both already. Yeah, so especially in Angular 1, there's going to be a little bit of impedance mismatch between those two, because Redux essentially is all about putting all your state in your application into one immutable data structure, and then sharing pieces of that across your component tree. And the points made earlier about the use of immutable data structures in Angular 1 and the trouble you may have with that applies to that. But Redux really is really tiny, and it can be made work with both quite easily, I think, both Angular 1 and 2.
Yeah, so it seems like these two implementations, they're just architectural decisions, right? And if that's the case, then what are the goals of React and Angular 2? Like, what are they like trying to solve? What's their focus, in your guys' opinion?
That's a good question.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'll start off. So, like, it seems to me like React seems to be focused on just being the view, right? Like, it's been advertised as just a view, and because of that, its focus is just managing like one particular element, and that's it. And the idea is that you could compose like many React components together. That's the same with Angular 2. You could do the same thing, but with Angular 2, you also get a lot more stuff. Like you get a DI system that you can plug in, and it has more of an opinion of how you could do things, but it allows you to actually do more things as opposed to Angular 1, where you're kind of limited by the architectural decisions made like 6 years ago.
Yeah, I guess it comes back to the kind of kitchen sink point that Angular 2 just bundles a lot more of these things, whereas with React, it's the assumption that whenever you do something more than just a simple couple of elements in a UI, you are going to combine React with a number of other libraries like Redux or some Flux implementation.
Yeah, so it seems like with React, you have React, and then that's pretty much it. In Angular, Angular 2, you have Angular 2, you have the router, you have a state management system, like their version of store, and you have all these different components that are given to you by default, and you can choose to use them or not, and they're maintained by the Angular team. In React, it seems like they only maintain the one core, and then everything else is left to the community to figure out.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I've got a question. So the developer experience, DX, is starting to get a big name. I'm a big fan of developer experience. I think it's important. APIs are important. And so I'm curious about the developer experience with Angular 2 versus React, because I know with React, if anybody hasn't watching or listening hasn't watched Dan Abramoff's talk from React Europe about time traveling, oh man, like that made me want to quit Angular and just go all React. It is an amazing talk, and that kind of developer experience just is not possible with Angular 1. But I'm curious if you're familiar with that. Basically, like you have this concept of hot module replacement, which allows for hot reloading. So hot reloading is different from live reload, which and actually JavaScript Jabber had Dan on the show just like last week, so check that out. But yeah, so hot reloading is different from live reload. Live reload just refreshes your browser. You lose all the state. You load all the JavaScript anew, and that's really common. One thing that I actually don't like personally. But for hot reloading or hot module replacement, basically it when you save your file, it replaces the code that's actually running in the browser with the code that you just saved without actually refreshing the browser at all. And so it makes for very, very fast iteration times. And so then there's also the time travel piece with Redux and being able to step forward and backward with the Redux dev tools and that kind of thing. So what's been your experience with Angular 2, the developer experience? Is it too mature to tell, or can you see the capabilities of these kinds of things with Angular 2?
Well, as far as I remember from his talk, he is creating some proxies of the actual components he rendered, and when any of the components file changes, he just replaces this component, just like you said. But the model, the store is isolated from the component tree. So if you have good separation of concerns in your Angular 2 application, I think that this is completely possible.
Yeah, I think the architectural key there is to exactly to keep your state separate from your component trees. With Redux, you have this single state atom where your state tree lives, and that can survive your code reloads as you're developing. And then the time travel part comes from the immutability, which is that when you go to the next state of your application, the previous state is not destroyed because you get a new tree of state, and the previous one you can preserve it in your developer tools basically and go back to it. And that, yeah, easily done probably in Angular 2.
Yeah, so it's worth noting that like this time travel feature is totally doable in Angular 1 and Angular 2. It's just that no one's done it. And the feature of hot module reloading, that's something that hasn't been done in Angular 1 or 2 because again, no one has built it. But this whole movement of developer experience is great, and I would say it's really early to talk about it, the Angular 2 side, because it's literally like all those like developer experience stuff has been pushed back towards like the end of the development cycle for Angular 2. Like they're totally planned. It's just that they're focusing on making sure everything else connects correctly.
You got to have a framework before you can develop it with a good experience.
Yeah. So they're constantly iterating, and it's honestly like it's alpha still.
So on that vein with the developer experience, maybe this is less developer experience and more like feature, but I wanted to ask about server rendering, and if that, I think Jeff and Patrick, you have a pretty good story on the server rendering piece of this.
Well, I think the question is more about obviously in React they have that feature and they've had it for some time. I'd be curious to know whether each of you guys have actually used that in React, first of all.
I have actually not, no. I've never done a universal style application in any framework yet.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't done this as well. I haven't had the need to do so.
Okay. So, yeah, I mean, not necessarily something we have to talk about at length, but I think from what Patrick and I've seen for our work on the Angular 2 side is that definitely something that is very easy to use in React. I think that they're still working out some of the performance issues, like it's getting better all the time and that type of thing. But it's going to be interesting to see kind of moving forward. I think a lot of people do like the fact that it's there when they do need it. I know a lot of people that in the React community that do use it, that do have like consumer-facing React apps, and it is extremely useful. So it is, in my opinion, it's great that all frameworks kind of start to go down this road of being capable of being universal, even if, like obviously you guys are working on stuff, probably internal apps that don't necessarily need it per se, but the more that we can do this, the easier all of our lives would be, because both sides I can see kind of help each other with the kind of advancements they make.
Yeah, so to touch more on that, it's like where we're seeing people using server rendering, it's more of like enterprise, like Yahoo, like Twitter. They went from a client, from a server side only to client side only to back to this hybrid model of both. So it's great to see that like Angular 2 now has server rendering. So now that story is like there, and Jeff and I will talk more about this during Angular Connect, and maybe we'll even demonstrate like how fast it is compared to others.
So I'm curious, like we talked about like a couple small features here, but from your opinion, Taro and Minko, are there use cases where you think that one framework is preferable or the other? And it might be, I guess, either use case in terms of the type of thing you're trying to build, or the environment, like who your team is and like that type of thing. Like, do you guys have any opinions on in those two factors? Like, what would lead you to pick, use one over the other?
Well, one factor is really that there's probably a few people in every team that have a very strong opinion about this, and they usually have a big influence on the whole team's decision. I don't tend to have one, so I just tend to go along with what the majority feels like doing, because honestly I think you can kind of succeed or fail with both of these. Is more about what you do with them than what they actually provide at some point. So I would be happy using either in most cases. I can't think of a type of application where one would be that much better than the other.
It's like choosing between a battle axe and a long sword or something. Like both are pretty effective. You just use them differently.
Yeah, I guess one thing is that with ClojureScript or one of these other kind of compiled to JS languages, some of them are more. There's just more existing tooling to using, say, ClojureScript with React than Angular. I don't think there's anything with ClojureScript, say, an Angular 2 yet at all. At least I haven't seen anything. Whereas React is really strong in that community.
In my opinion, the main difference, as we said, between these two frameworks is that Angular comes with more things in the core. So it has its dependency injection and the router. So you don't, if you are building something from scratch and you want to have all this stuff, and you want to know that everything works together and it is well tested, maybe you should choose Angular 2, because otherwise you need to wire up different components, and most of them are built from the community, and there are different releases, there are some breaking changes, so it might get a little bit more risky if you use React.
That makes sense. So we are running pretty close to our time, and we do have a question or two on Twitter with the hashtag NGR question. So if you're watching live, ask on Twitter NGR question if you have any questions. But we do have a couple more questions from the panelists, and then we can run into those, and we'll also let you, if the guests have anything you'd like to bring up before we close out, we'll let you have that chance as well. So, take it away, panelists.
Patrick, I think you had a question.
Yeah, Patrick is currently editing the Google Doc instead
Oh,
of
whoops. Sorry. So like.
Oh, I can go while he's editing. Because just sort of tacking on just a final thing for talking about kind of differences and that type of thing. The one last question I had along those lines was the communities. That there is a large community built around Angular and Angular development, and same with React. And I've always gotten like a slightly different like feel for the different communities when I go to meetups, when I kind of interact with the people that work on it. What are your guys' opinions on kind of differences within the communities?
I feel that the people in the React community are with a little bit stronger background in the functional programming. That's just how I feel.
Yeah, I think I have a similar viewpoint, mostly because I've approached React myself from that side of my projects, which is ClojureScript part. So it really comes out of that really. And, but yeah, I'm much more involved with the Angular community in general than the React community. So I don't have an even like view of both of them.
So I guess I could say a little bit about this. I submitted a React survey similar to the Angular survey. What was interesting is that like at the very bottom I asked what was one of the features that you liked about React, and at the very bottom I put hype. And what was really interesting is that 90% of people actually like that feature. And it also it's yeah no it's interesting because like during like this like Angular 2 hackathon I met someone who was a React enthusiast, and he was so far into this like React hype that it was very much apparent compared to like other people who are more grounded and understand the benefits of the two and still use Angular because it's more of like a framework as opposed to just a particular view or a particular component. But what's interesting is to see like a lot of people in both communities use both of them, and it's reflected on both sides from the survey.
Yeah, I guess in general React is in a different place on the hype curve in general than Angular is, which has been around a lot longer. So that shows in all of the kind of discussions on Reddit or wherever you go.
Yeah. Speaking about hype curve, have you guys heard about this JS repay challenge?
No.
Yeah, so someone basically created a JS repay challenge and wrote in every framework repainting, so that way you can measure like what's the repainting like performance for each framework. And what's interesting is that if you actually open up the three optimized versions of Angular 2, Angular 1, and React, you'll actually notice Angular 2 optimized version, aka just track by, is actually faster than React. And if you actually open up Angular 2, you can see that it's also 60 frames per second with Angular 2. So it's really interesting to see that the problem here is more just like the developer code rather than the framework itself, because you can optimize in any framework. It's just that people choose to optimize or choose not to optimize, right? Would you guys kind of agree with that, or?
Definitely, yeah. It's much more about your code than the framework. And the other point about that is that you can find the benchmark to support whatever opinion you have.
This makes me think of Dave Smith's recent post, How to Miss the Point When Comparing Web Framework Performance. Yep. So I'll post a link in the show notes. But yeah, it's very good. And basically the conclusion is, yes, you can get Angular to be very performant, and in many cases just as performant as React. But his argument is the big difference is what's the default? Is it easy to, or is it natural to make React fast versus whether it's natural to make Angular fast. And his argument is it's more natural to make React fast than Angular. But anyway, I think we're coming down on our time. So I think here's a pretty good last question. So some people have been switching from Angular to React because of problems, whatever preference. When Angular 2 is officially released, do either of you see people switching from React to Angular 2? As like, would you consider that people would switch from React to Angular 2?
Yeah, I will do that. Yeah, I have some preferences, and my favorite currently is Angular 2.
Yeah, I'm sure there will be a lot of people. Also because, yeah, people switch teams, and it's not always, we don't make our own framework choices always, and we go to different places where different cultures are dominant, and that's just how it works. So I expect to be using both of those and a bunch of other things that probably can't even name yet. But it's just kind of going to be like that.
Gotta love the JavaScript world. It's amazing. Cool. Okay, so let's wrap things up here. I'm going to go over to Twitter. We do have one question, and it's from Erwin Dutton, and he says, suppose you have to stick to pure ES6 in a project, so no TypeScript, no preprocessor like that. It's just obviously you need Babel in today's world. So what would you choose between Angular 2 and React if you had to stick with pure ES6?
Not even JSX.
Oh, dang. Yeah, you didn't think about that one. But Babel technically compiles JSX without any flags turned on, so I guess we can assume JSX is supported. But yeah, that's a good point. Maybe answer both questions in both scenarios.
I really haven't seen much of the Angular 2 examples that are not TypeScript, so I can't really speak to how that feels like. So I don't know.
I guess parameter decorators are going to be kind of tricky with ECMAScript 6, but still, I don't know as well. I mean, both seems like a good choice.
So you think that it's pretty much a given that when you use Angular 2, you will be using TypeScript for sure?
I think with both of those, we'll be using tools that let us do whatever we want to do in the source code level. So I'm not sure I would anytime soon run into this particular limitation in my projects.
Cool. Okay. Sweet. So before we go into tips and picks, I guess I should have done this before we went into the questions. But I think it'd be great to open it up to the guests if there's anything else that you wanted to bring up about this subject before we start wrapping things up.
Try Redux. It's cool.
I'll take your advice as soon as I find time. Hopefully I find time soon.
Yeah, there's actually an Angular 1 Redux implementation that also has a time traveling feature in there.
Nice.
I gotta look into that. Okay, sweet. Well, let's jump into the tips and picks. We'll let our guests go last, and we'll start with Patrick JS. Can you give us your tips and picks, please?
Yeah, so my tip is always be learning. I may have said this previously in the past, but always be learning, never stop learning, because as soon as you stop learning, your knowledge starts degrading. So like you always have to keep refreshing yourself. And my pick is this OSS computer science repo. Basically, it's an open source, I guess, self-taught graduate computer science course. Basically, just like a whole bunch of like online courses combined together into this what you would consider a computer science course. So it's pretty cool. especially for someone who wants to like figure out like what they should learn or not learn or what they don't know.
That sounds like something that I desperately need as somebody who didn't graduate in computer science.
Yeah.
Cool. Amy, why don't we go with you next?
Sure. So my tip is to check out Taro's blog post on the component pattern. And my picks, the first one, if you're a visual learner, I saw this tweeted or something, or it came maybe in the JavaScript newsletter, but it's a promise visualizer, so that's really, really cool if you want to play around with that. And then I have another pick, since everybody's been talking about their family the last couple episodes. Today's my husband's birthday, so I'm going to force him to listen to the end of this episode so he can hear me say happy birthday. So that's it for me.
Awesome. I hope you don't tell him happy birthday at all, and this is like the only way he can hear.
Too late.
Of course. Cool. Jeff, let's go with you next.
Sure. So you mentioned it earlier, Kent, but I do want to recommend watching the JavaScript Jabber episode with about Redux. I really enjoyed that, and we got into a lot of interesting topics. And also, I want to point everybody to a talk that I had 6 months ago at NG Vegas, talking about myth versus reality with Angular. It sort of touches on a lot of subjects that we talked about today, and in particular, I sort of, at the end, I talk about how really urging people to not be trolls, which, Kent, you're probably going to laugh when I mention this part. But no, I mean, I seriously like thinking productively and positively about any situation that it's all JavaScript that we're working in, right? Like whatever framework you happen to be using, and anything that you want to do, you could get done. So it's kind of silly, the sort of wrecking on somebody else's stuff or framework that does go on in different blog posts and that type of thing. So I want to encourage people to be more positive about it, be more like cooperative to help each other, because the reality is that Angular has learned a lot from React, and I think that a lot of stuff coming out of the Angular community has helped React as well. So hopefully we can kind of continue that in the future. And don't be trolls.
That was great. That was awesome. Next, so is following in the same vein, components, components, components. Make everything a component and make as many dumb components as you can. Yeah, that's good. And then I have a couple picks. So first, Code Cartoons. This is by, this is a, I don't know what these are called. It's a Medium organization or something, but it's on Medium, the blogging platform, for, yeah, my friend Lynn Clark created a Code Cartoons org where she's going to be posting a lot of different blog posts that use cartoons to describe different topics. I think the next one she's probably going to work on is explaining Redux. But the last one was a cartoon guide to Flux, and it's fantastic. So if you're wondering what this Flux thing is, I recommend you look at that. It explains it very, very well. Another pick is Frisbee Golf. Get out and throw some Frisbees, or disc golf, or frolf, whatever you want to call it. I think that's yeah, it's fun. And I'll throw this in there too. Another pick, I wrote a blog post yesterday entitled "Why I Don't Commit Generated Files to Master," and and I also explain how I don't do that. So it describes some of the reasons you might want to commit to master these generated files, but then describes some of the challenges that you'll face with that, and how you can get around that and have your cake and eat it too. And this is specifically about libraries. Projects are maybe a little bit different. So anyway, yeah, check that out. Let's go with Minko. What do you have for us?
So I have two things. There is a great talk by Pete Hunt from, I think he worked at Instagram, I'm not sure where he is now, React RESTful UI rendering. It's a very interesting talk where he compares the reactive user interface with distributed systems actually. And the second pick is, it is an issue in the Angular 2 GitHub repo which aims to develop Angular improvement process, which seems a pretty cool idea. Basically, I guess it is going to allow us to propose different features we want to test in Angular, and if they make sense, maybe they're going to be discussed and eventually implemented.
Cool. Thank you. Tero.
Okay, so my pick is the book Refactoring by Martin Fowler, which is kind of one of these software engineering classics, which I hadn't read in many years, but now that I'm working on this component refactoring, I revisited that, and it's actually really useful. The actual concrete refactorings in there are not directly applicable to JavaScript or Angular code, but the principles are, which are tiny changes, controlled changes, and unit testing, and all of those things are very much relevant when doing this kind of refactoring in Angular. And my tip is also related to this, which is bind to controller in Angular 1.4. You can actually use it to make bindings on your controller without having an isolate scope. So you can have scope true, bind to controller, then an object of bindings. And that's really useful while you're doing this refactoring, because you can start introducing these bindings one by one without breaking your code, without isolating everything inside the component just yet. You can take this step by step, and that's very nice. So you can just do one and see that everything works, and everything else is still coming up from the parent scope. And that just gives another one of those really good intermediate steps in this refactoring.
That's a great tip. I hadn't actually thought about using that as part of the refactoring process. Awesome. Okay, let me double check the NG-error question hashtag. Looks like we have nothing, so I think we're going to wrap up our show. Remember, next week, we don't know what we're going to talk about, but it's going to be awesome, I promise. And so tune in, same time, same place. And yeah, I think that's, remember to follow us on Twitter and Google+, @AngularAir. And hopefully this show will be up by the end of the day. Maybe I should make that commitment to everybody so that I actually make that happen. But yeah, I just will wrap up this show saying thank you, Mikko and Tero, for coming on the show. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me.
See you all next week.
See ya.
Bye.